I'm David Raynes. I used to be a Customs and Excise investigator. I had 36 years in Customs. I retired in 2000. Around 25 of those years were spent dealing with fraud and drug smuggling. I'm also a member of something called the International Task Force on Strategic Drug Policy, which is a worldwide organisation of professionals, scientists, drug workers and so on, and we meet regularly, annually in conference to promote, basically we believe in prevention rather than liberalisation. We don't believe that society will be benefited by liberalisation and legalisation of the currently legal drugs. My opponents would say I'm a professional drug warrior because they become increasingly frustrated when I demolish most of their arguments.
And what do you prefer to call yourself?
Well, I'm a volunteer. What I do, I don't get paid for. My professional life now, semi-retired, is I'm an international consultant on customs improvement and organised.
Can you tell me why you agreed to do this interview?
Because you asked me. And I was curious as to what were your driver for doing it. Okay. Particularly when you say to me that you don't think the drugs debate is properly done. And I've been heavily engaged in it for years and years, and I think it's just completely overdone, and there's too much of it.
And what should we be doing instead of having a debate about drugs?
Well, we should be doing better at what we should be doing anyway. We should be trying to stop kids from using drugs in the first place. In the early 70s, I was the first heroin and cocaine intelligence officer in any organisation in the UK. So I've followed the drugs debate since the late 60s. I've always been interested particularly in heroin and cocaine, which is what I worked on mainly in the 70s. I've watched the debate frustrated about the way it's gone. When I retired, I was always concerned the effort that we were putting into interception and interdiction wasn't having the social benefits that people believed it would have. And I thought there had to be a better way. And I support the National Drug Prevention Alliance because I actually believe that stopping kids starting using drugs is more important, the most important thing. And demand drives supply. If there was no demand, there would be no drugs. And demand has gone up as there's been cultural change in our attitudes to drugs. If you can even delay experimentation, that is a significant improvement in our current situation. The problem we have at the moment is that drugs use is starting earlier and earlier, usually tobacco and usually cannabis and alcohol experimentation, but cannabis particularly is very, very dangerous for young 11, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds. And we have a situation in the UK where we're worse affected by drugs, probably illegal and legal, than anywhere else in Europe, or we're certainly in the top 2 or 3.
How do you think we delay kids from starting to take drugs?
Well, one of the things is we could actually give consistent messages as a society, and we don't have consistent messages. We've had, in respect of drugs, illegal drugs, we've had what I call media advocacy. We've had media advocacy since the mid-90s in respect of some drugs, particularly cannabis. I mean, the classic example of a media advocate would be Rosie Boycott when she was, I think, editor of The Independent on Sunday, and she advocated liberalisation, decriminalisation, going towards legalisation of cannabis. That was immensely harmful. And drugs policy in Britain has been most successful over the last 20, 30 years when the 3 main political parties have been together. Drugs are bad and don't use drugs. A consistent societal message. But the consistent message from society is that drugs are all harmful, and I include the legal drugs. I don't make exceptions. The real problem is kids using, say, cannabis at 13 on the way to school, at school, and on the way home from school. Those kids have become unteachable. And the worst affected kids, the very heaviest users, and the 1 in 4 that are especially vulnerable, they're incapable of being taught. And of course, they opt out of education. They fail to reach their academic potential. They fail to reach their physical potential. They fail in life. And of course, the kids that are not working, a lot of them unemployable and unemployed, a lot of that is a result of early drug use. Alcohol's in there as well. Why do they do that? That's peer pressure to be part of a crowd, and we have to educate young people to be independent, to be free-spirited, to know that they don't have to do what everybody else is doing. Early sex comes into that as well. That's peer group pressure driven, we have a very high rate of teenage pregnancy and unmarried mother pregnancy. Why is that? Again, peer pressure. And society has never got to grips with that. I remember as a young teenager, people buying cigarettes in fives from the newsagents. And like all young children, I probably experimented with a few cigarettes, but I've never been a smoker, so I didn't really do that. But people did. You know, I was keen on sport. The driver for me was sport and health, which it is nowadays for a lot of boys. You know, boys smoke less than girls. And that's the driver. They're more interested in sport. They're more likely to play sport. They're physically fitter than girls.
So you had a positive focus rather than being attracted
yes,
to
I mean that's part of it, isn't it? That you're doing things. You're climbing mountains. You're out. You're physically doing things. Drugs is sitting in and I mean, pot isn't called dope for nothing. You know, sitting around stoned in a flat didn't attract me on a Saturday evening. Used alcohol, but in moderation. You know, a few beers. Everybody overcomes their distaste for alcohol. I think Winston Churchill said, you know, everybody dislikes beer and overcomes it. And I'm a modest real ale drinker now, and the occasional glass of wine, but that's it. Well, my father was very, although he died early in my life, he died when I was 12, but certainly very keen on physical fitness, a mountain climber, walker, cyclist, and that's what I've done all those things. So they drive your attitude to life, really. I was a child of the 60s, so, I mean, drugs were all around me when I was growing up. I never used drugs, and I didn't have any friends that used drugs. Well, they were around everywhere in the 60s. Cannabis was around, but I didn't go to university. Well, I knew people who took cannabis, but they weren't my friends, but it was evident. And there was some, I mean, you were conscious in the newspapers that you know, flower power of that generation started using cannabis. A lot of the drugs used in the 60s was driven by people going to university and getting away from home and parental restrictions, as it is now, but it starts earlier now. But in the 60s, it was that was where drugs were. At the end of the 60s, of course, I was working in customs then, and I became aware of heroin trafficking. But I did see the sad example of the queues of people with their prescription outside Boots in Piccadilly in London at midnight, waiting for the next day because they could get their prescription filled. And that's terrible to see that queue of society's rejects, really. And they weren't poor people, a lot of them then. I mean, at the time when heroin was being consumed at the end of the so-called British system, a lot of the people who were heroin addicts were wealthy people, advantaged people. And in London particularly, it was the socially advantaged, other than ethnic Chinese, who used heroin. And into the early 70s, cocaine use, again, tended to be the socially advantaged. Not the case now, but it was the socially advantaged. So there's a lot of nonsense talked about poverty being the driver of drug use. It's absolute rubbish because historically in the UK, that wasn't the situation. I was in customs and excise, and I became more and more involved in catching drug smugglers at Heathrow, and eventually I went into the investigation service, the detective service, and was more involved in that side of the work, which was targeting major importers. Criminal gangs in the 70s, it wasn't. I wouldn't have described as criminal gangs. People have a wrong understanding of how criminality works. The UK drug market hasn't been broadly driven by criminal gangs. Not early, anyway. Later, yes. I mean, the original cannabis smugglers were the likes of Howard Marks. You know, they were university educated and quite bright people who believed in legalisation, liberalisation of particularly cannabis. And you know, I knew him.
Did you manage to catch him ever?
He was caught once by customs, but he talked his way out twice. He was caught once, went to prison in the UK, but he talked his way out twice by pretending he worked for security services abroad. But he did very well, but he was a major trafficker. Cocaine was trafficked by entrepreneurs. I mean, a lot of that, again, driven by quite wealthy people, a lot of them quite highly intelligent, wealthy traffickers, until the South Americans got into the British market, which changed it. Heroin was driven in the 60s by the ethnic Chinese, who had always had a heroin problem. They smuggled heroin. In the early 70s, the Iranians started coming over, escaping the trouble in that country, and some of them started bringing brown smoking heroin. And we were very vulnerable to smoking heroin. There'd been a lot of injecting before, but we had a generation of young people then who'd been brought to smoking pot. They smoked cigarettes, they smoked pot, so smoking heroin didn't seem so threatening. Iranian heroin dominated the market in the mid-70s, and towards the end of the 70s, the Turkish Cypriots got involved, and the Turks and Turkish Cypriots dominated the market from then and still dominate the importation, although there's some Pakistanis involved now. Mm-hmm. I've given a lot of my spare time to trying to improve the quality of this debate and trying to rebut the wilder suggestions from the legalisation lobby that society would somehow be better off if we legalised all these possible substances of abuse. I think it's fundamentally not in the interests of society. I mean, we have a model for drugs use, don't we, worldwide? We have tobacco and alcohol. And it's absolutely plain that that's culturally driven. Tobacco use in the UK is much less than in, say, Eastern Europe, where 80 to 90% of the population smoke. In consequence, their health problems associated with tobacco are massive. The Chinese, again, are smoking a lot as well. But alcohol, it's plain worldwide, the massive harms from a legal drug of alcohol. And although Westerners, like us, are adapted to some extent to manage alcohol in our bodies, there's massive damage, massive social damage, massive personal damage, massive family damage. And it's plain that there's much less damage in countries where there is a social, legal or religious taboo against use. Morocco makes alcohol, but very little alcoholism. Pakistan doesn't make alcohol, virtually no alcoholism. So those models of tobacco and alcohol are my backdrop for legalisation of the others. I do not see how we would be better off if we legalised fentanyl, for instance. Fentanyl is an addictive drug which is used in operating theatres, but there are people who would have that legalised. Well, we're doing something about tobacco in the UK and in much of the Western world. Consumption's dropped since my youth because people are better educated. And the more educated people are, the less they're inclined to smoke. And we're having more social restrictions on it. And one would have to recognise that the ban on smoking in public places has been a major incentive for a lot of people to give up smoking. And it has been successful. That's the use of law. That's the use of law to reduce the social harm and personal harm from tobacco. So,
what about alcohol?
Well, alcohol we've got a big problem with. We've got binge drinking. It's cultural. And we see other countries, the Italians didn't have it. Their habit of being infected by it a bit. Alcohol's a big problem. You can't make it illegal. It's too embedded in society. So that's not possible. But we could increase the age of drinking in the States. It's 21. I'm not necessarily advocating it. I need to think it through more. Because at the moment, young people under 18 freely get alcohol. And there are some alcoholic products that are only sold to get people drunk. If you go into a Tesco's and see White Lightning cider at 8%, what is the point of a cheap industrial cider? I don't think it's reasonable to say that people aren't going to smoke and they're not going to use alcohol. They're too embedded in our way of life, and you have to be realistic and pragmatic. We can try to minimise the major harms of those substances, but whether we should incorporate other substances, normalise the use of those other substances, I'm very much against that. I mean, people do journey through drugs use apparently untouched by it, particularly if they start experimentation later, which is why I would say to you that if we can get young people, if they're going to experiment later, that's a major social achievement. I mean, if we could prevent experimentation to more or less the university age group, which it used to be in the 60s, and casual use, that would be a major social achievement.
But aren't you almost doing the very thing you said society shouldn't be doing, which is kind of saying it's okay if you
No, I'm not saying it's okay. I'm far from it. I don't say it's okay, but I recognise the realities of policy. Our problem at the moment is that we give inconsistent messages to young people. When they're going to use cannabis for the first time and they're 13 years old, they've had a government in place that downgraded cannabis. They've had a government in place that stopped customs stopped interdicting cannabis, mostly, deliberately anyway, targeted at the end of 1999. And the market was flooded. Can you tell me what it was about? Because we've now put it back up again. The government's put it back up 4 years later. What was that about? Nobody really believed in it other than the liberalisers and legalisers, and look where it's got us. Because we've got early...
Has cannabis use decreased since they downgraded it?
You mustn't believe everything you read in the statistics. One of the things about the British Crime Survey, which is what I assume you're talking about, is that it didn't sample use below 16. So if your first use starts below 16, and starting earlier and earlier, that was never incorporated in the statistics.
As I understand, it's not just the British Crime Survey. There
are some indications now that cannabis use has stabilised, dropped.
And that's actually within a couple of years of cannabis having been downgraded.
Yeah, you're making a link there that people make. They make that link because it suits their debate. But let's have a bit of common sense. How many cannabis factories are there in the UK?
I'll just give you my personal opinion on why I believe cannabis use has decreased. I think it's because when they downgraded cannabis, there was so much information out there about how it caused psychosis and the link to psychosis that actually the amount people suddenly realised what they were doing, and I think that's why
I was part of that publicity. And if it has decreased or stabilised, I would tend to agree with you that there's been a lot of publicity, which I've been part of the driving of, which has said cannabis is much more harmful than heretofore. That's true, and it may have stabilised, but we still have a huge cannabis use problem.
So you don't think it's decreasing, it's stable? Because I think it has decreased, and I think it's because of that publicity. It's nothing to do with how the fact they reclassified it.
I'm very edgy about saying it's substantially decreased because of the number of cannabis farms and because of the cannabis seizures. There was a huge one in Glasgow last week, and there's a lot of cannabis on the move worldwide targeted on the UK. There are some huge seizures of resin, but the homegrown cannabis, the cannabis factories, that's a new industry that started in the last 4 years. That was more or less unheard of before cannabis downgraded. If cannabis has slightly reduced and it's being used earlier, the consistent fact about the last few years is cocaine use is starting earlier, and cocaine use is more widespread. In fact, we've had figures on that last week. So I don't think you can separate these drugs issues. They're a cultural issue, and people are more inclined to use drugs than they ever were 30 years ago. The UK's got worse than other countries, and we've got much worse than we were. I say that's largely as a result of lack of political consensus, which I've described. Secondly, we've had media-driven commentating in favour of liberalisation and legalisation, which individually might not affect adults, but it does affect young people when they're making that first decision. If there are people arguing for legalisation and liberalisation, that sends a signal to some young people, well, it's not that bad. And there's been a consistent pattern of behaviour from media advocates and paid media advocacy of trivialisation, particularly of cannabis and other drugs, normalisation, and their objective is legalisation. Trivialise, normalise, legalise. That's their long-term objective.
Outside of the media, if a young person sees a friend of theirs smoking cannabis and doesn't perceive that that friend is hugely adversely affected, is that not more likely to have a strong impact on them than what they read in the media?
Let's get real. If you see somebody smoking cigarettes, do you see them hugely adversely affected if they're 17 years old? The fact is that the first use of a drug, it's very difficult to tell, unless most people aren't that adversely affected. But we know tobacco causes all sorts of diseases. So it's about perception. But we are seeing more young people seriously distressed by cannabis. And most young people will know somebody who is what they call a pothead. I went to my granddaughter's school and heard the Somerset County Education drugs advisor. I heard her speak. I heard her tell parents and grandparents that drugs use is inevitable and there's nothing you can do about it. That's not true. That's not true. Your kids can be kept away from drugs. They can be kept away from smoking.
If they know people, if they see people who are taking drugs and they perceive in their very short-term view that it's not doing them the harm that they've been led to believe, isn't there going to be a problem with them believing what else you tell them about drugs?
No. I mean, you're making a leap. Because what are they led to believe about cannabis? It's how it harms the brain. That's all they're being told. And of course, smoking's bad for you anyway. They're being told that. Kids smoke tobacco because young teenagers, their brains haven't developed. They don't understand about risk. That bit of the brain develops later, and they believe they're invulnerable. And that's not just true of drug using, it's true of risk-taking behaviours. All sorts of. That's why young lads drive cars too fast. you know, their brains, they're not developed. They think it isn't going to happen to them, and they're not accustomed to understanding and debating internally risk.
But should you give them information and trust them to make informed decisions, or should you say,
"Oh, yeah, I wonder how long it would take us to get to that."
I told you.
No. I wondered how long it would take us to get to that. It's terrible words. Informed choice. That's the words, the mantra that's trotted out by the legalisation, liberalisation lobby. Informed choice. It's wrong. Informed choice. There are lots of things in life where we ought to say to kids, no, that's not a good thing for you. Informed choice means that we believe that they can make a sensible decision. Did all those kids who smoked cigarettes and became addicted and got cancer, were they making an informed choice? They were making a choice, but was it the right choice? We can't leave it to them. We have to set them a framework, a health framework. I don't call it a moral framework. I'm health driven. I'm not a moralist. I'm not religious, and I'm not coming from a moral agenda. But there are things that are bad for people, and we have to give them consistent messages. Expecting them to make informed choices is the worst kind of absentee landlordism. You know, we can't ignore our children. We should do more for them than that. They deserve better. Clearly, a lot of people do function reasonably well and still are illegal drug users. That's patently obvious, because the extent of the degradation. I mean, if you're a cannabis smoker, your head isn't right, and it takes a long while to get out of the body. But they can function reasonably well. That's plainly true. Like even we have many high functioning alcoholics. Winston Churchill was a high functioning alcoholic, so we know that that's possible. Yes.
Okay, and if that's possible, is it not possible then that some people can take illegal drugs and function?
Well, that's what I just said, yes.
Right.
Some people can function reasonably well.
Therefore, getting everybody to absolutely not use any form of drugs whatsoever, is that desirable, given that some people can function healthily within society and be good citizens and be users of what are currently illegal drugs?
There's a question mark about whether they're being good citizens. I mean, if you're a high-functioning cocaine user in the city and you're using cocaine heavily, eventually it gets you. Eventually, like tobacco eventually gets you, like alcohol eventually gets you. But some of these things can get you quicker than alcohol would. I mean, Winston Churchill lived way into his 80s, was he 90? Alcohol gets you eventually if you use it, and cocaine will get you.
You've gone into addiction. You're not as high functioning if it's.
Well, of course, because it's a slow degradation.
What about moderate people who choose to use moderately?
Or they can use moderately for the whole of their lives.
Mm-hmm. I'm not talking about cocaine and heroin, which are, as scientists have ranked the most addictive drugs. Cocaine and heroin are in the top five with alcohol.
I put nicotine.
And nicotine's up there as well. Nicotine. All of those, and alcohol are in the top five. But I'm talking about, let's say, ecstasy or LSD.
Alcohol isn't addictive for most people.
Ecstasy or LSD.
Look, nicotine is addictive for almost everybody who consistently uses it. Alcohol plainly is not addictive for most people because it's widely dispersed through society. And most people aren't alcohol addicts.
I'd beg to differ, actually. I think most people who drink alcohol find it pretty tough to go more than a month without a drink.
That's not my experience. Admitting to oneself that one's got addictive behaviour is pretty difficult. Most people don't admit it. Even your high-functioning regular drug users don't admit addictive behaviour. It's a slow degradation of physical and mental state, isn't it? It's a slow degradation, and there are some people who can do it. But you're using that as an argument for, presumably, against having laws against those drugs. You're saying that
I'm using it as an argument.
I don't know why you're using it then.
Because I'm trying to understand your perspective and flesh it out and look at it.
Well, if you flesh it out, these drugs are basically bad. I mean, tobacco and alcohol are basically very bad for society. We're stuck with them. But I don't see the point in social, personal health terms, in normalising the use of any of the others. But what on earth is that about? What is it for? Why? And I also hear the argument that legalise drugs and you take the crime out of them. That's a frequently used argument. That cannot happen. 20-odd% of the UK tobacco market is counterfeit, smuggled, or both. It's been higher. In other countries, Spain and Italy, it is higher. We've got the real mafia, the real Italian mafia, involved in trafficking tobacco goods to the UK. So legalisation of the currently illegal drugs will create a situation it's open house for crime, because crime can always undercut a legal supply. So unless government...
Isn't the problem, isn't tobacco smuggled in this country because the tax on tobacco is so high?
No, but it's smuggled...
If I'm not advocating legalisation, but you're the one who's raising this point. So if you're talking about legalisation, or I think transform regulation...
I can deal with that.
If you're doing that...
Well, let me deal with it. Can I
finish the question, though? And if those drugs are set at a market rate, that means then you're eliminating a massive amount of crime, and you're taking a market away from.
This is absolutely nonsense. Yes, a high rate of tax will increase the incentive for crime to target a particular country, but the tax is lower in Spain, the tax is lower in Italy, and tobacco is smuggled worldwide, where the tax is almost non-existent. So you cannot take crime out of illegal drugs. Criminals love use-reinforcing substances. They love them because it's a repeat market, and they can always undercut legal supply. I think the one thing that's not widely understood is how much money has gone into the liberalisation, legalisation debate, which has affected all the cultural values of society, because the UK is very badly affected. The word that's loosely used is recreational drug use. In your questions, you've implied some people can use drugs recreationally and not suffer adverse consequences, and obviously at the margins that's true, but the social corrosive effect of us all using more drugs is deeply damaging, and it's being financed by big business. I mean, I can name names, I won't name names, but we've had people in positions of significance within government who have apparently been working at some period of their lives for those big money interests. And I really need to say no more. But it does affect the culture in which drugs are used and decisions about drugs use are made.